Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Christian Lloyd. I'm the Academic Director at the Bader International Study Centre. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to the Castle. I've been asked by the Queen's Events team to remind you that this session will be recorded. What I'm going to do today is give you a sneak preview of a new history of the Castle that I'm writing with Dr. Stephen Bednarski. I'll talk for about 30-35 minutes, and then I'll make sure we have 10 or 15 minutes for any questions you may have at the end. And it's significant that I'm talking to you from the Elizabethan room, because one of the stories I'm going to tell you today is a ghost story, and the ghost materializes on the very staircase behind me. There are two other stories as well. One is about the castle during World War II, and the other one is about a rather strange painting that JMW Turner did of the castle and some detective work I've been doing around that. But we'll start with the ghost story. So I expect all of you know this person here, the Headless Drummer. If you remember, he was a boy musician who died in the service of Sir Roger Fines. He was the guy who built the castle originally in the French campaigns of the early 15th century. And during a battle, unfortunately, this young person was decapitated. His body was returned to be buried near the castle and then reappeared periodically on the battlements playing his drum. And this is such a famous ghost story about the castle that it actually appears on a 1932 cigarette card that you can see on the slide. But that cigarette card is in a series on smugglers and smuggling. And what it suggests is that this story, the legend of the Headless Drummer, has been used by smugglers to scare people away from the castle, where they would be hiding contraband like tea and brandy and so on, smuggled over from France. As you see in the image on the cigarette card, the Headless Drummer clearly has his head. He's wearing clothes that have been painted with some luminous material, and he's playing his drum to scare away the locals. So it's a cover for criminal activities on the estate. What's interesting about the Headless Drummer these days is that he hasn't appeared for a couple of centuries, as far as I can tell, no recent sightings at all. And I was wondering if post-Brexit, smuggling might get going again between England and France, but he's still not been seen. So what I want to really focus in on today is a more recently sighted ghost. And this ghost appears in the 1920s when the castle was owned as a private residence by this guy, Claude Lowther. You can see his dates there. Lowther buys the building in 1911 when it's a ruined shell, when the garden is overgrown. And his reason for buying it is that he wants a country house. So he sees this ruin and thinks, I can rebuild that and live there. Lowther's an interesting and I think slightly mysterious figure. As you can see on the slide, that's him outside the House of Parliament. So he's a politician, he's an MP. He was also a soldier, a playboy, host, art collector, diplomat, playwright, sportsman, and socialite. And perhaps the last of those is his most important role in life. Lowther comes from a privileged but slightly suspect background. His father was the illegitimate child of the Earl of Lonsdale and Amelia Crisotti, who was an Italian opera singer. So he has an aristocratic background, but it's somewhat illegitimate. And he grows up a rich young man in London. In his 20s, he has this drunken playboy life in London. So he lives at the Albany off Piccadilly, a very prestigious residence. And he indulges in pranks, such as throwing a dummy in evening dress into the stalls from his private box at the opera in Covent Garden to scare the people below. All of his early projects in life really fail. He's an honorary attaché, so he's a kind of amateur diplomat. He's an unsuccessful playwright. He writes this one play that gets booed off the stage. And the key moment in his life is his purchase of Hurstmonceux Castle with money that he inherited from his father. He buys the castle, I think, to legitimate himself and to give him a venue to which he can invite the great and good down from London. So he's really a social climber as much as a politician. When Lowther gets the castle, he begins restoration work immediately, concentrating on the south face. So that's the face of the castle with the gatehouse, the moat in front of it, and the bridge over the moat. Because that was relatively intact, it was more a case of shoring it up than rebuilding it. And you can see on the photographs, scaffolds erected around the castle, huge gangs of workers redoing the brickwork, taking off ivy, all that kind of stuff. And the focus was preserving what was left. One local commentator at the time said, quote, "Workmen were trained to build in the old fashion with the old materials." If you think of the dates there, clearly after 3 years, World War I interrupts the reconstruction. But after the armistice in 1918, Lowther continues his rebuilding project and begins rebuilding the Great Hall and the chapel, and furnishing all of the rooms in his own eclectic style. He spends a lot of money on contents for the rooms, including medieval tapestries, 18th century French paintings, Louis XVI furniture, harps, all kinds of instruments and so on. But perhaps the outstanding acquisition is the grand staircase that you saw behind me in the Elizabethan room when I was on shot. That came from a place called Theobald's Palace in Hertfordshire, which had been the home of Sir William Cecil. And we're fairly sure that Elizabeth I visited Cecil there and would have walked up that very staircase. So Lowther, wanting to make his castle look fantastic, buys this staircase from a rather rundown palace and installs it in Hurstmonceux Zoo. And you can see on the slide on the left, the private quarters that he took as he began the rebuilding. So it's what you know as the drummer's room. It was then called the drummer's hall. And photographs show a four-poster bed, rugs on bare walls he's installed, paneling, very, very nice, perhaps a bit chilly. And for those of you who've been lucky enough to visit the castle, and been in that room, you will know there is a secret drinks cabinet built into the paneling, because Lowther was quite fond of wine. So Lowther becomes this kind of ringmaster in the 1920s of the castle, and Hurstmonceux Zoo is the site of wild partying, high society networking. There is a memoir by Violet Bonham Carter, who's a sort of society person, which recounts a weekend there in June 1916. Quote, "We crossed the drawbridge over a grassy moat and passed through the great archway of a double gatehouse to be greeted by Claude Lowther, dressed in black knee breeches, black silk stockings, and buckled shoes as though for a court ball. And Lowther's outfit is so on point that Bonham Carter worries that the royal family have secretly been invited to this weekend at the castle, because why else would you dress up like that? In fact, it's Winston Churchill and his wife Clemmy who Lowther has down for the weekend. Lowther's dandyism, spending vast amounts of money on his outfits for all occasions, earns him the nickname Colonel Loud Clother. So Claude Lowther becomes Loud Clother. He's notorious for being sort of Mr. Dress Up. And much effort was expended by him in cultivating society figures. So he invites people like Kathleen Youngdown, Captain Scott's widow, who's a notable sculptor, Chips Shannon, who's a diarist and an MP, Lady Diana Duff Cooper, who's a film star, and so on, and many, many more less distinguished parties for the weekend. And we have an interesting view from below stairs from the servants from the time. So Verily Anderson recalls how the antics of the guests on these boozy weekends attracted gossip from the servants. Quote, "No sooner was a bedroom finished and furniture put in it than two people were sleeping in it, but not always the same two the next morning, my Kate said when she was in service down there. They wasn't like our tea garden gentry. They was nobles what could do as they liked, and liked they did." Anderson goes on to give a flavour of a more respectable dinner party to which her father, who was the vicar of All Saints Church, so that's the church just up the road from the castle, was summoned. The first invitation for mother and father to dine at the castle was not on embossed stationery delivered by hand, but in the modern way by telephone by Bishop the butler. He followed this call by asking her not to wear black or navy as they would not blend with the colonel's cushions and curtains. The food was always delicious, eaten off priceless silver or pewter plates, one of which the host might hurl playfully at his butler, then go down on his knees to beg forgiveness. So you can see it was a fun house, and a riotous time was being had by Lowther and his guests. Now, with that background to the ghost story. So, as you can see in the image, the ghost known as the Grey Lady appeared at a 1929 party hosted by Lowther in the Elizabethan room. So you can see a couple of party goers at the bottom and the woman fainting as the Grey Lady points at her. And this was recounted at the time. What happened was the two guests came through the gatehouse, over the bridge through the gatehouse, and then entered the Elizabethan room, and it was gloomy at that time. Lowther had electric lights, but it hadn't been turned on. So as they, in her beautiful dress and his dinner jacket, made their way into the room and were about to climb the staircase, suddenly the Grey Lady appears with a full Elizabethan dress on. You notice the ruff and the bonnet there, and confronts them, points threatening at them, and they're terrified, switch the lights on, and of course she disappears. Who was the Grey Lady, and why do we think she might have appeared to these particular people? Well, the Grey Lady is Grace Naylor, who's the only child of George Naylor, who was a widower who purchased Hurstmonceux in 1708. Grace lived in the castle, and there is a legend that she was starved to death by her governess. That's absolute rubbish. She actually died in adulthood in 1727, and there's a plaque in the parish church to prove that. But she certainly must have lived a lonely life here, just being with her father when she would have preferred to live in London. And so I think the vision of the Grey Lady wandering the pastures of the castle might be a sort of parable, a ghostly parable, about the frustration and loneliness of a young woman who's cut off from a much more interesting life in London. She's adrift without her mother. She's probably got no chance of getting married or doing anything else much. She's just kind of stuck here. So I would say this terrifying incident articulates kind of jealousy. You know, maybe the Grey Lady is jealous of the 1920s parties. The woman's a flapper there who has freedoms that she didn't, and is having fun at the castle where Grace had none. So when Stephen and I look at the accounts of ghosts in the book, we're always looking for those kind of psychological explanations. I always think ghosts appear for particular reasons in particular places. There's one more horrifying thing here. The Grey Lady's appearance at the party that I've just told you about was recounted in the Ogden Standard Examiner. It's an American newspaper a few weeks later. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the page where they give the story of this haunting. And you can see there's something slightly American about that. So the illustrator for the newspaper dresses Grace as an Elizabethan lady, when of course she belongs to an entirely different century. It's an anachronism. And praises the brave American girl who scoffs at ghosts and just adores haunted rooms. I think this was tempting fate, I'm afraid, because the girl was called Ivor Lawson. She was a Texan who bought the castle with her British husband, Reginald Lawson, after Lowther's death in 1929. So Lowther died shortly after this appearance. And her husband died in rather odd circumstances. It goes down as a shooting accident. That can mean many things. In 1932 at Scotney Castle, which they also owned, and Ivor then returned to America. So the moral of the story is, I guess, don't mess with the Grey Lady. My second episode in the castle history today concerns a rather odd relationship between the man on the left of the screen, who is John Fuller, a Sussex MP, and also sort of bon vivant. You can see him with, you know, massive dinner in front of him, bottle of wine in his hand, someone who liked to live life to the full. And then the man on the right, who is J.M.W. Turner, the foremost English artist of his day, and a political radical, someone who was openly campaigning against slavery, for example, in his work and in his life. And the two of them came together because Turner accepted a commission from Fuller. One more thing about Fuller, he used to be referred to as Mad Jack Fuller because he was very eccentric. And the image you can see in the center is actually his mausoleum where he's buried. Rumor had it that he designed the pyramid himself, and rumor had it that he ordered that he was going to be sitting in front of his dinner, dead inside the pyramid. That's how he wanted to leave this world, I suppose. And you kind of see the pyramid behind him on the right there. So a deeply eccentric man. Anyway, Fuller had agreed to pay Turner 100 guineas, so a vast sum of money, for 4 watercolours of his estate in West Sussex and some also nearby views of Sussex as well. The watercolours were to be reproduced as gifts for Fuller's circle. And the reason Fuller was spending so much money on getting Turner to do some images for him was because he was trying to repair his reputation. He was quite a violent person, Fuller was, and he had a terrible drunken fracas in Parliament, which concluded with him spending 2 days in the Tower of London because he threatened the Speaker of the House with a sword. So, Parliament in those days was a quite different place from today, where people actually there was sword play and threats in play there. And interestingly, while on this trip down to Sussex, Turner also painted Hurstmonceux Castle. So 2 images on the screen. On the left is one of the sketches that Turner did of Hurstmonceux Castle. He did 5 sketches actually. And then on the right is the finished watercolor that he completed in his studio thereafter. And I was lucky enough to go to Tate Britain, to their manuscripts room, and they will get out, I was quite surprised, not being an art historian or anything, that they will get out Turner's sketchbook for you and let you look at it. And it's incredibly delicate because it's a small book. It's 5 inches by 8 inches. It's done by pencil, and then he puts sort of little highlights on in chalk, which of course, if you knock the page or touch it with your hand, you will ruin. So they will let you look at it, and it's thrilling to do that, but you have to be super careful with that. And I love what you can reconstruct from that. You can tell, for example, that Turner walked clockwise around the castle while sketching it. You can see his journey as he goes page by page through his book. Noticeably, all of the sketches soften the castle's outline and emphasize its place in a lush natural setting. So at the time Turner's sketching it, the exterior of the castle is still intact. The parkland is still in quite nice shape. So it's emphasized as being really surrounded, in some ways dominated by nature. The painting that emerged from these sketches is titled simply Hurstmonceux Castle, and that's what you can see on the right. It's in a private collection now, so the only access we have to it is a reproduction like that. And again, if you look at that and think about the way Turner's done that, the man-made structure, again, is diminished in importance. You can see the castle is sort of faintly represented in the middle, not very obvious, just a couple of the turrets on the top stick up into the sky above the tree line. So the natural world really dominates the building with the cattle and the pond, and that's still there. Again, those of you who've been to the castle would walk down that from Bader Hall on your right-hand side every day. It's still there, that little pond fed by a stream, with a very heightened version of the hill to the immediate east. So Turner has made the hill on the right-hand side of the picture to the east of the castle look a lot bigger than it actually is. And it leaves the castle itself somewhat indistinct and sort of squashed into one little segment of the sheet. In short, I would say this is a pretty terrible painting. Turner has not put much effort into this, not really anywhere near his normal standard. So why does he do that? Well, I can only speculate, but here's my speculation, and I think it's an interesting one. So as I was looking through the notebook, I noticed that on the back of one of the sheets of paper that the castle is sketched on, there are some lines from a play, and I looked this up and found they come from a play called Venice Preserved. It's a tragedy written in 1632 by a guy called Thomas Otway, and it had been revived in Turner's time, so it had been restaged. So Turner could have actually seen it in London, perhaps, we don't know. What are the lines? This is what Otway writes. Where's the distance throw me back so far, but I may boldly speak in right, though proud oppression will not hear me. So what those lines mean is, as loud as I speak, and I will speak loudly the truth, those who are arrogant and oppressive will never hear me anyway. And these lines are spoken by Jaffia, a character who is caught up in conflicts between powerful and corrupt political figures. So I think Turner's chosen those lines very, very deliberately. They're on his mind when he's thinking about Hurst-on-Zoo Castle, when he's thinking about his patronage by Jack Fuller. And remember, Turner has sympathies for radical causes. You know, for example, he's against slavery. I think he's having a surreptitious dig at his patron, Fuller, who made part of his fortunes from inherited estates in Jamaica that were worked by slave labor. And in his will, Fuller actually, as you could then, passes on these slaves as part of his inheritance. So, you know, he is involved in a very dirty business indeed, and Turner has taken his money, and Turner knows that. What this tells us, I think, is that for our book, but also for students' own research and for other researchers working on the castle, there are many, many more stories to tell and many, many more ways to contextualize this building than have been done to date. We often think of the castle as quite an isolated building because it's so beautiful, it's in the middle of the countryside and so on. But of course, from the beginning, from when Fiennes builds it, it's really in the middle of a web of forces, cultural, political, economic, sociological. It's not isolated at all. It always has a very strong relationship with London, for example, and France and so on. And in this case, with empire through Fuller's estates in Jamaica that Turner knows about. So one thing we're encouraging students to do at the moment is to research castle history with this in mind. And we are uncovering, students are uncovering at the moment some very interesting LGBTQ histories of the castle. They've never really been written about before. We're starting to uncover all kinds of interesting people who lived here, owned the castle, worked here and so on. And that's really exciting to really reframe the castle in terms of different concerns, different sorts of people. I'm really pleased that that's in motion now. My last story is about World War II at the castle. And this episode takes place in the castle grounds in 1944. So on the left, you can see what was known as a buzz bomb or a Doodlebug, or more properly a V1. So it was one of the German vengeance weapons that were deployed really towards the end of World War II, so 1944 in this case. And it would have been launched from a base in southern France, heading for London, but sometimes crashing in southern England accidentally. On the right, you can see the remains of a house in South London that has been, or several houses that have been hit by a V1 strike. So it's an immensely powerful early cruise missile. It's pilotless, it's a drone, and it has a 1,000-pound warhead, you know, tremendously destructive weapon. And the reason it's called a buzz bomb was because it had a very rough sounding kind of engine. It kind of buzzed as it went overhead of you. And when the engine cut out, it just fell to earth. So that was the moment you need to take shelter. And so it was on a timer. So they thought they could measure the distance and just have it cut out the right moment to land on London. Of course, V1s landed all over the place because it was quite a faulty mechanism, that was. And as a result of those sort of accidental targetings of Sussex, 323 people in the county that the castle is located in died in V1 explosions in World War II, just in the last 2 years. Many, many others were injured. People often think of the castle as being quite isolated during World War II, that it's in this safe location. It's 60 miles south of London. It was quite sort of peaceful here and so on. But that's actually completely untrue. In fact, to some degree, the castle was on the front line during World War II. The Luftwaffe were overhead every night on their way to bomb London. We were right on the flight path, so you'd hear their engines overhead. And you could tell it was the Luftwaffe, not the RAF, because the Luftwaffe didn't synchronize their engines. So a two-engine plane would sound quite rough, whereas the RAF would always sound smooth because they synchronized their engines. So you'd know it was the enemy overhead. There was, of course, the threat of invasion here as well. We're really close to the coast, and it would be very, very easy to land on the quite smooth and shallow pebble beaches near us. So there's constant threat of invasion. And the castle was marked by the war. There were bunkers around. There were clearly military installations on the site. So it could readily have become a target. And there are stories about the castle being strafed by German aircrafts, by fighter bombers. I cannot corroborate those. So until I do that, I can't say that's a fact. But it's highly possible because we were sort of 20-minute flight away from the Germans' bases in northern France. In World War II, the castle was the home of the Hearts of Oak Society. So that was an insurance society that had moved down from London during the war because they knew London was going to burn during the Blitz, and they got their records out here. So it sounds kind of boring. You'd think it would be a spy school, sort of James Bond type stuff, but no, it was a place of bureaucracy, but very important bureaucracy, so that people were insured against unemployment, got benefits when they were pregnant and all that kind of thing as well. So the castle during World War II was actually populated by mainly young women who were working as clerks for the Hearts of Oak Society. And they were in danger. They had, there's a large air raid shelter still in front of the castle. They would have heard, enemy aircraft overhead all the time. And then one day in 1944, in the summer, this happens. So you can see we are about 200 meters to the southwest of the castle. There is a mother and a child standing there, and that vast crater is created by a Doodlebug, by a V1, which landed just by chance really close to the castle, probably as the result of engine failure. The other thing about the Doodlebugs was that they had a reserve fuse. So if they didn't go off on impact, they had a time fuse later. So you had to be very, very careful. It could go off shortly after landing. If this V1 had hit the castle, and you can see how close that was, I think it would have taken the front down. I think that would have been curtains for the building, really, because remember on the previous slide what it did to a London house, or several London houses on a street. So it's amazingly lucky it didn't hit the castle. And you can see signs of war all around. You can see the big huts in front of the castle, huge huts that were built for people to live in, and also as offices for the Hearts of Oak. So the castle is actually right in the midst of the war. This is a total war. The figure in the foreground there is Peggy Grant. So she's a woman married to Sir Paul Latham's butler. Sir Paul Latham is the last private owner of the castle. And she's there with her son. And I think what's going on there is she's probably trying to make light of this. It would have been a tremendous explosion, really frightening, trying to sort of make it a game for her son or something like that, so he's not absolutely terrified by this. During the castle, even before World War II had started, refugees from the Spanish Civil War were temporarily housed at the castle, and Sir Paul Latham encouraged staff to join up in the Territorial Army as the war began to get closer. It's more obvious we were going to war. Once the conflict got going, we have a fantastic memoir which is unpublished by Peggy in the Castle Archive, and she talks about hosting some French Canadian soldiers for Christmas dinner one day while her husband was away at war. Now you can imagine how the local gossips got going on that, and that's not too pleasant. That said, being here wasn't all that bad because they could get black market produce here. She talks about being able to get eggs from local farmers, which was illegal, but everyone was doing that. She could also, there were a lot of Canadian soldiers, but also RAF men in the area. There was RAF men nearby, so they could go to dances and at least have a bit of fun. There was, however, death at close hand in World War II, for example, when one of the French Canadians was killed in an accidental shooting there. So it was, a very, very difficult period for most of the locals. However, as the war progressed, I think it must have been a tremendous highlight on the morning of D-Day to see the whole air armada go over to begin the assault on mainland Europe as well. So that must have been a real sign of change at that. And again, we are getting students into the Bisque archives to research previous residents of the estate. So they'll be working with things like Peggy's memoir, thinking about gender history of the castle, because it was a place inhabited by young women during the war, and also to develop their academic skills as well. We've had a new research coordinator, Dr. Claire Kennan, to ignite this process, and you'll be hearing about her work on our social media. She's starting a blog with the students and so on. So there is so much still to find out about the history of the castle, and so many new approaches we can take. It's become a really exciting period for history here. There is, in fact, a way you can join in with this, and one major section of the new book about the castle is going to be on the history of what was the ISC and then the Bader International Study Centre in honour of Alfred Bader's birthday. The name was added to, from a student and faculty perspective. So I will be putting a shout out on social media for people to give their memories about their time at the castle, how they perceived it, because we are now in our 27th year of having students here, and there is a really interesting history. A lot has changed over that time. So please, if you're alumni or you taught here or worked here, I'm very, very interested in gathering your memories, and I'm particularly interested in contemporaneous memories. In other words, if you have letters or emails that you sent home at the time, you'd be willing to share, because that's what's always interesting, people's impressions at the time and how those change. And so, as I said, we will have a shout out on social media at some stage, and I'd be really grateful if you, any of you would contribute towards that. The book should be out in spring next year, and again, we'll be promoting that when it emerges, and we will get copies across to Canada if people are interested in that. So thanks very much for listening. I'll be really happy to take any questions you may have now.
There we go. Hello?
Hi. Hi there, do you have a question?
Oh, no, hello, Dr. Lloyd. It's Joellen Warden.
Oh, hi.
What a wonderful presentation. I don't have any questions. I'm just here to say hello, send my regards, and enjoy this wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. That's really kind of you. Thank you. It's nice to hear from you. You can ask me about anything at all. It doesn't have to be about the presentation. Anything about the history, I will do my best to answer, or I can find out if I don't know. Nice digs indeed. Yes, thank you. I've been in this room sort of in the gloom many times by myself, just leaving the castle late at night, and I've never seen a grey lady. The castle always feels like a really comfortable building to me, but that's actually appeared right behind me. I'm doing a little bit of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Go for it.
Right, what I'm going to do. Okay, well, aha. Yes. So we have a question there about the field school for global health and disabilities, and that is indeed going strong. Thank you. We are that has continued every summer for several years. We already have a good enrollment for this summer, so yeah, that's been really pleasing. Run by Beth Rycombe, of course. So yes, that's still going strong. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, while you're thinking, I'm just going to talk to you about a further episode in Castle history that we've been researching recently, and it concerns the 11th Astronomer Royal, a guy called Richard Woolley, who arrived at the castle in 1956. If you remember, from the end of the Second World War through to the mid-1980s, the castle had been sold by the last private owner, Latham, to the Royal Greenwich Observatory. So that's hence the science centre on site with all of the telescopes. Woolley he was not considered generally a very nice person by his staff. You hear all these stories about him. If you play tennis with anyone, you basically play for hours until he won. So he was a horribly competitive kind of person. But he had one really brilliant idea, and that was to introduce 6-week summer courses for undergraduates, largely from Oxford, but also from Scotland and elsewhere. And actually an interesting mix, about 60-40 men to women, so quite a good mix for those days of female students. And what they did on these courses was the students actually lived in the castle, where the prof's offices are, for those of you who can remember where those are. And they did nighttime observing, did some other labour for the castle, taking down data and so on, and then took classes on astrophysics and computing during the day. And one of these students was a guy called Stephen Hawking. So I'm sure you're all familiar with him. He was then at University College, Oxford, and he was 19-year-old. This was before motor neuron disease began to afflict him. And when Hawking died a couple of years ago, lots of material came out about him for people who knew him. And some of this was images of him at the castle, sitting on the bridge, playing croquet on the lawns, lounging about, sunbathing and so on. So Hawking clearly had a great time here. And the people who knew him while he was here said that he was the only student that Woolley, who was the Astronomer Royal, would ever allow to disagree with him, because Woolley realised very quickly that Hawking was a genius. He was the cleverest student he'd ever come across. So they used to have great arguments in class. Anyone else would just be shut down instantly. So while they got on an intellectual level, we discovered that they had very, very different politics. So Woolley had come from South Africa, but of course it was an apartheid regime, was very, very right-wing, whereas Hawking was very, very left-wing. And one tradition at the castle was to get your daily newspaper delivered here, because of course pre-internet, they probably barely had TV here in those days. Most people would get, I don't know, the Times or something like that. But Hawking got the Communist Daily Worker newspaper delivered here. I don't think Hawking was a communist. I think he was just doing it to wind up the Astronomer Royal. I think, he was left with, I don't think he was that left with as far as I know. And for his end-of-term prank, Hawking did something really brilliant. So if you think that this is at the height of the Cold War, when he's here for this summer, what does he do at the end of term? Well, some of you will have been lucky enough to have been up where the flags are. We sometimes tour students up there. Hawking crept up there the night of the final, sort of the end of term party, took down the Union flag, which normally flies there, and raised the hammer and sickle, the Soviet flag there, Really, it's very unfortunate that Woolley, the Astronomer Royal's reaction is not recorded to that. I can imagine the flag was hauled down fairly swiftly thereafter. But what a great way of sort of setting his stall out by Hawking. And he then, of course, went on to become one of the world's greatest scientists. So again, someone else who has an interesting and hitherto unknown connection to the castle. A few questions have come in, which I'll do my best to answer. Please clarify how to pronounce the name of the castle. So the name is an interesting one because it has a Saxon and a French element or a Norman element. So if you think that obviously comes from the time of the Norman invasion. So Hurst is Norman, Monceau is French. Hurst, Monceau, you put those two together and you get a kind of awkward word. So if you're pronouncing it sort of correctly, you would say Hurst, Monceau or something like that. The Sussex pronunciation is Hurst Monceau. Okay, that's the way the locals pronounce it. So that's what we use. Hurst Monceau is the way to pronounce it. Which social media should we send our memories of the castle to? What's the answer to that? I've got a couple of people here. Oh, it's in the chat. Okay, thank you very much. That's good. Okay. Any last questions? We have just a couple of minutes left. Thank you. Oh, thanks for watching. That's kind of you.
If there's no more.
Okay, so I'm afraid our time is up. I've really enjoyed putting this together, and I'll be thanks for the questions and comments. I really appreciate that. Do look out for the book when it comes out in spring, and look out for the social media call for contributions to that, because I would like a really substantial assessment of the castle, the project that the Baders allowed us and facilitated in so many ways for us. I think it's time to have a real retrospective on that. And to think, what we have all achieved together over 27 years, some amazing things happened here. And I would like people's honest perspectives on that. I'm not writing a kind of boring corporate history here. I want it to be dynamic, I want it to be real, and I want the real history of what happened here. So please feel to follow up with me about any of the topics discussed using the email that is provided in the chat. Do enjoy the rest of your homecoming, and thank you very much. Hope to see you all here in person someday. Thank you.